Externalities of consumption. An externality is a benefit or cost that the behavior of a firm or individual imposes on another firm or individual through their behavior. If the firm or consumer imposes a benefit on others, it's called a positive externality. If the firm or consumer imposes a cost on others, it's called a negative externality. Let's start with externalities of consumption. And in particular, let's review a little bit about the theory of consumption that we developed way back in the first lecture. Recall that every consumer tries to maximize their total level of satisfaction or utility. And to do so, they determine whether the cost, which is usually the price of a good, is less than the benefit they get from it. If the cost is less than the benefit, they consume. If the benefit's less than the cost, they don't. So when we survey consumers about their demand schedule and their demand curve, they can tell us how much they're willing to buy at each price. But there was something we never included in that calculus. We never worried about whether an individual's consumption of a good would have any impact on the satisfaction or utility of others. In particular, would it have a negative impact on other people? Here's some examples of negative externalities. Your neighbor likes dogs, so he has a lot of them, and they bark all night and keep you awake. Notice that your neighbor, in making their decision about how many dogs to have, doesn't take into account your sleep schedule. Or, you have a roommate who has strange taste in music and likes to listen to Wagnerian opera at high volume constantly. When they make that decision on what to listen to and when to listen to it, they're not taking your satisfaction level into account, and they're imposing a cost on you. Someone who lives up the hall from you likes to cook a lot, and they especially like to cook food with lots of garlic in it, making the whole hallway smell like garlic. Again, when they choose what to cook, they're not taking the impact on you into account. Notice that in each of these cases, one person's consumption of a good has a negative impact on another person's total satisfaction level. But the person making the consumption choice doesn't take into account that negative impact of his or her decision. So they don't include all the costs of consumption in their decision on how much to consume. They only compare their private costs with the benefit they get. They don't compare the total cost to society of what they choose to consume. Here's how a negative externality of consumption looks graphically. Notice that we have our supply curve, but we have two demand curves. One demand curve is for the private individual. That's what we get when we ask people about their demand schedule. On that demand curve, the individual is only taking their private costs into account in deciding how much they'll consume at each price level, comparing benefits and costs. But society does suffer from those costs, from the negative externality. So that means that at every price level, society would want you to consume less, because society compares all costs with the benefit of consuming the good. Let's take a look at market equilibrium. For an individual, they would find the equilibrium amount they want to consume by looking at the intersection of their private demand curve with the supply curve. And across all individuals, that would give us a quantity like QP. However, society would compare the intersection of the demand curve for society, which includes all the costs, with the supply curve. And society in equilibrium would want you to consume the quantity QS. So because of the negative externality, the market leads us to an output where we consume more than what is socially optimal. This is a market failure, where the market has done something inefficient. There are also positive externalities of consumption. The individual or firm does not take into account the positive benefit of their actions on someone that imposes on someone else. That is, in consumption, the individual does not take into account the positive benefits of their consumption on other people. Here are some examples of positive externalities of consumption. You take care of your house and yard, so your neighbor's property values go up. You wear a nice perfume, and everyone else gets to enjoy it, not just you. You vaccinate your children against measles, which helps protect other children as well. In each of these cases, you have gotten a benefit and compared it with the cost. But there's an additional benefit to society that you didn't take into account in choosing how much to consume. So once again, let's look at our demand curve and our supply curve. Now the two supply curves are switched. Your private supply curve only takes your private benefits into account. You don't think about that extra benefit to society when you're comparing your own benefits and costs and deciding how much to consume at each price. However, society would take all the benefits to everyone into account, so demand is greater for society than it is for the individual when there's a positive externality of consumption. And notice that if you were to find the equilibrium points, society would want a higher level equilibrium, than would the individual.